Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you, and I'm really pleased to be able to spend this time thinking about the life of Isaac Watts, lessons from it. I'm a great believer in learning from church history. It's one of the ways we can step out of our own frame of reference. Things are different in the past. They ask questions we wouldn't have thought of. They give answers that we wouldn't have given. And so I think there's great value in learning from those from the past. I want to tell you briefly about Watts's life. We're going to cover that fairly quickly, and then I want to cover some key areas in his thought. So Watts was born in 1674. Back then, it was still illegal to be a nonconformist. People were fined for attending a nonconformist church. And he grew up in Southampton, where his father was a deacon of a congregational church. And if you're a deacon, you weren't just fined. If you're a leader of some sort, you could also be imprisoned. Now, Watts writes a notebook, and when he's 9 years old, we read this in his notebook. 1683, my father persecuted and imprisoned for nonconformity 6 months. After that, forced to leave his family and live privately in London for 2 years. So Watts knew from an early age what it was to suffer for your convictions about church, and he remained a convinced nonconformist the rest of his life. He was a bright boy. By his mid-teens, he knew Latin, French, Greek, and Hebrew. As he grew, his poetic ability became very clear as well. So we have in his own hand this acrostic poem based on his name. Immortal God in persons three, sweetly convey thy grace to me, aid me with wisdom from above, and compass me about with love. Cover my failings, blessed Jehovah. Wash off my sins, make clean my heart, and righteousness to me impart. Teach me to understand aright thy sacred word, and with delight shall I peruse it day and night. He wrote that when he was 6. And I'd be pleased now, but he was bright enough to be offered kind of the equivalent of a scholarship at one of the 2 English universities, Oxford or Cambridge. But that would have required conforming, becoming an Anglican, and so he declined. He studied instead at what was called a dissenting academy. He then became a tutor in a kind of well-to-do household, then assistant pastor, and then pastor at Mark Lane Chapel in central London. That's where John Owen had been pastor some decades earlier. While he was pastor, he published a number of books. The first book was on poetry, and he is still listed as a kind of not insignificant poet of the 18th century. Later came a book on logic, or the right use of reason. This was a standard textbook in not only dissenting academies, but at Oxford, Cambridge, and Yale. He wrote theological works like this one, called The Freedom of Will in God and Creatures, exploring sort of the theological basis of God's providence and freedom of action. Also works on the Trinity, redemption, the passions, pastoral ministry. Most famously, of course, he wrote his hymns, and he's called the father of modern hymnody, and we'll come back to his hymns later. But he also wrote children's songs. This book, in fact, was one of the best-selling books of the 18th century, over 7 million copies. Watts was said to dominate Christian singing from the cradle to the grave. He suffered from significant illness in his life. He had various times of extended absence from church ministry, and a co-pastor was appointed to help him in that work. But he remained pastor until his death in 1748. And he's buried at Bunhill Fields in central London, along with a lot of other famous nonconformists. His life then, if you know your dates, spanned the end of the Puritan era of the 17th century through to the revivals of the 18th century. So he heard John Howe preach in his youth, and he met and talked and spent time with Whitefield and Wesley in his old age. Now, the Puritan era and the revivals are better known periods, and in an average church history, the bit in the middle is passed over in a sentence which says, "Not much happened." Well, those were the years of Watts's ministry. He lived to see the revivals, he interacted with them, but the majority of his ministry was in a time that was quiet. Not much happened. But I'd suggest, as a result, it's much more like our time. Let's think about the days Watts lived in. I'm going to be simplifying things here for the sake of clarity and time. If you know more about this, bear with me. The early 18th century saw a rise in the view of reason. The Enlightenment, scientific progress through people like Isaac Newton and others, rationalistic progress through people like John Locke, who wrote about how we use our reason. People's confidence in reason soared. It's hard for us to get hold of today, but rather than the traditional things of receiving traditional knowledge or just believing religious dogma, people started to speak of the unbiased, clear light of reason, enlightenment. Alongside that, usually came suspicion of passion, or we would say emotion. That was seen as the opposite of reason. When your passions were raised, your mind was clouded. You didn't think clearly. Too much passion made you what the 18th century called an enthusiast. And in the 18th century, being an enthusiast was a bad thing. The word has changed over time. Probably the best word today would be fanatic, effectively. And fanatics aren't reasonable. Now, that is a great generalization. There was the rise of early sentimentalist thought, which was more positive about passions, but the negative picture was dominant. And this had results. This resulted in the cooling of religion. Sermons focused on morality, services were dry and dull, preachers were concerned to show their reasoning and how reasonable they were and avoid any enthusiasm. There was a rise in natural theology. We can find out all we need to know from nature and reason. So we don't need revelation. Some started to speak of revelation in Scripture as only a kind of republishing of what we could know from creation and reason. It might seem remarkable to us, but that's what they said. And this then resulted in what I've called reasonable religion. People were at pains to show that their beliefs were reasonable, which meant airbrushing out anything that didn't fit with reason. The Trinity, the atonement, the work of the Spirit, all came under question. Arianism, Socinianism, and then eventually universalism was the drift for many churches. Those are Watts's times. Well, let's turn to his thinking then. What I want to do is to talk about his theology of reason and passion as two key areas, and then show you how they flowed out into his ministry. First of all, he had a theology of reason and passion. He thought about how our faculties worked. So if we begin with reason, he saw that as the faculty that helped us judge and assess, to determine right and wrong. He had a very high view of reason. We'll come back to that. He saw reason as giving direction to our will. It guides us how to live. And our reason also should guide our passions. In other words, it doesn't just tell us what is right, but it shows us what we should love and hate. It shows us what we should feel. Then to complete the diagram, Watts thought that our passions had a motivational effect on our will. Not a directing effect, motivational. That is, it is not just when you think something is right that you'll pursue it and do it. It's when you feel that it is good. Or it's not just when you know something to be wrong. It's when you feel it is evil or ugly that you will avoid it. And that motivational effect of passion will be important later. Now, that was how Watts saw our faculties as created by God. And he then has effectively a biblical theology of the passions. He talks about how they're created in this way. This is the pattern as to God has made. Then he examines how they are fallen, because he sees sin as overthrowing this pattern. He focuses particularly on the effect of sin on the passions, and how the passions then overthrow our reason and our will. And then he sees the original pattern restored in conversion, in remaking us, regeneration. God reestablishes the way our faculties work. So here's a quote. He says, part of the Spirit's work is to reform our natures, to put all our misplaced and disjointed powers into their proper order again, and to maintain this divine harmony and peace. It is the blessed Spirit that inclines reason to submit to faith and makes the lower faculties, that's passion and will, submit to reason and obey the will of our Maker, and then give us the pleasure of it. So part of his theology of conversion is restoration of our faculties. I'd suggest that's not an area we've thought about a great deal. Now, that's a quick summary of some of his view on our faculties, and I want to show you how that then underlies areas of his ministry which we can learn from. So a couple of areas. First of all, Watts acting as a defender of the faith. Remember the context. Reason is running high. That's leading people to reject biblical Christianity. They don't think it is reasonable. Well, how does Watts respond? Well, first of all, he has some many very positive things to say about the rise of reason. He writes work engaging with the philosopher John Locke, has some significant engagements with him, and appreciates a lot of what he says. So he buys into some Enlightenment thought rather than simply knee-jerk rejection. But he argues for the limitations of reason. He shows that while reason is good and to be used, it is limited because it is fallen. So he says, the eye of the understanding is strangely blinded, and the judgment strangely perverted by the fall of man. We are led into false judgments of things by the corruption of our minds, by the unhappy influence that present sensible things, things we can touch, have over our whole nature. And he argues that we need revelation. So he says, the revelation of God in an illustrious manner supplies the deficiencies of our reason and enlightens our natural darkness in the knowledge of divine things. Left in sin, our reason can't help us. We're in darkness, we need God to speak. So he defends the need for revelation, the authority of revelation, the work of the Spirit in opening blind eyes, and so on, to reform our thinking. I mean, familiar stuff to us, but this is at a time when this is the very issue being doubted and questioned. And he defends orthodox faith in this way. But he defends the faith in another way. He also shows the reasonability of the faith. He writes a work, for example, called Ruin and Recovery. It's about the doctrine of original sin, ruin, and about the atonement, recovery. Two very contested doctrines in his day. But look at the subtitle. An attempt to vindicate the scriptural account of these great events upon the plain principles of reason. So you see, in a culture that is elevating reason, he says, let me show you that these scriptural truths are perfectly reasonable, rightly understood. Let me vindicate them to you and show you that it's not madness to believe this. See, this is Watts writing. It's kind of the 18th century equivalent of Keller's Reason for God. That's what's going on. It's apologetics. There is, though, a danger here. And of course, it's the danger of elevating reason too highly, making it to the judge of things. Now, Watts is mixed here. He always said reason is useful. Now, you can use it to defend the faith. We should do so. We should defend it in this way. But of course, we believe revelation above our reason. But while he had that as a framework, this still led him into trouble. And we see that particularly in his works on the Trinity. He wrote for exactly the same reason, to try and defend the faith. He says that this doctrine was being mocked, and it was being mocked. And so, if we were 18th century pastors, we'd have people in our congregations questioning the Trinity. And so what's said in his dissertations on the Trinity, there are a number of works on this, just one of them, and in the preface he says, it seems proper, therefore, given it's being mocked, for some persons to endeavor to make it appear that there is a possibility in the reason and nature of things for true and eternal deity to be attributed to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, without danger of those absurdities and inconsistencies which are pretended to arise thence. People were saying it's absurd and inconsistent, and he was saying, no, we must show that it isn't. And so, like with the other doctrines, he tried to show that it was reasonable. But unfortunately, this led him into a rather weird Trinitarian scheme and explanation. He offered it tentatively, said it wasn't helpful, don't worry about it. He continued to speak of one God, three persons. He thought he was submitting to Scripture and simply defending the faith, but when you look at what he actually said about it, he's moved away from a standard orthodox position. I won't try and explain it to you. It's a bit weird. So I think for Watts, as a defender of the faith, there are a couple of lessons for us today. First, I think we should look at him and be encouraged to defend the faith in the battles of today. Watts was encouraging people to believe, evangelism effectively, and strengthening people in the church in their faith when they're tempted to doubt, in a day when rationalism was undermining the church. And he was so helpful to people, showing, you didn't have to remove your brain to be an Orthodox Christian. And we need to do the same. I've mentioned Keller already. Keller-esque ministry, if you like, showing that the things our culture values, whether it's tolerance or equality, sexuality, freedom, that rightly understood, the gospel can stand with integrity in the light of these things. So we need to be encouraged to have an apologetic angle. But we also need to be warned. And that is not to buy into the thinking of our culture too fully. And this can be quite subtle. You see, this isn't what happened with Watts was he didn't just give in to a pressure point. People didn't just say, the Trinity is a bit weird, and he went, okay, I'll change it. It's not like someone saying, well, this is our view of sexuality. And we say, well, okay, we'll change our view then. It's not just giving in to pressure. What he did was he used the tools that the culture would give him, or the methods and the arguments, and tried to defend it kind of on their turf. And there's a place for that, so that we speak their language and engage with them where they are. But if we only engage on their turf, eventually we will probably end up changing something in the gospel. To put it slightly differently, Watts felt like he could make the gospel, the true gospel, fit with reason, so that people who held reason high would say, oh, okay, I see, it's very reasonable. And take that to its extreme, it's like he would make it fit with his culture so that it wouldn't grate anymore. I think we should expect the gospel to always grate with aspects of our culture. And if in our apologetics we've made it fit too neatly, we may have changed. What he needed probably, it's easy to say from where we stand, is a more fully fledged presuppositional view of apologetics, where we question the assumptions behind the discussion rather than just running with the discussion as it's presented. But in the last analysis, I would say he did stand up for the gospel. He writes this towards the end of his ministry. Now, perhaps some may think it the duty and business of the day to temporize, and by preaching the gospel a little more conformably to natural religion in a mere rational or legal form, to bring it down as near as may be to their scheme, that we may gain them to hear and approve it, or at least that we may not offend them. Some may say, let's adjust the gospel as much as we can so that we'll reach people or not offend people. And he went on, but I am rather of the opinion that we should in such a day stand up for the defense of the gospel in the full glory of its most important doctrines, and in the full freedom of its grace, that we should preach it in its most divine and most evangelical form, that the cross of Christ, by the promised power of the Spirit, may vanquish the vain reasoning of men, and that this despised doctrine, triumphing in the conversion of souls, may confound the wise and the mighty and silence the disputers of this world. You'll see a bit of 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 behind that. That's a great call to us, isn't it? In a day when increasingly the gospel will be despised, to have confidence in it and God's working through such a despised message through his Spirit, and so confidence to keep preaching it in its full forms. There's Watts defending the faith. Secondly, I want to think about Watts promoting the passions. Remember his context. People are suspicious, by and large, of passion. Passion or emotion led people to being unreasonable enthusiasts. Well, Watts said, of course, the passions can be unreasonable. They're fallen. Of course they can lead people astray. But that doesn't mean it's wrong to feel, and it doesn't mean passions can't be used rightly. I think one of his best works is called Discourses on the Love of God, and the subtitle is The Use and Abuse of the Passions in Religion. And here what he's doing is encouraging passionate faith. He argues that God made us with the capacity to feel, and so we should feel towards God. Here's part of what he says. Has he formed my soul to delight and love? And has he confined these sweet and pleasurable capacities to be employed only about creatures, when the Creator himself is supreme in loveliness? Will not this most amiable of beings expect that I should love him and give me leave to make him my delight? If God is the loveliest being, we should feel love for him. And he said such feelings, the employment of passions, is part of true religion. We have to have the Spirit reform us for us to have right passions. But once that's done, that is part of biblical Christianity. And he thought it was a key difference between the cool and what he saw to be hypocritical religion of his day. So he says this: it is not enough for the eye to be lifted up to him, to God, or the knee to bow before him. It's not enough for the tongue to speak of him or the hand to act for his interest in the world. All this may be done by painted hypocrites whose religion is all disguise and vanity. But the heart, with all the inward powers and passions, must be devoted to him in the first place. This is religion indeed. The great God values not the service of men, if the heart not be in it. Now, Watts has a pretty sophisticated understanding of the passions. For example, he shows how the love of God is the chief of the passions, and shows how that will flow out into other things that we feel. He gives ways for the Christian to cultivate passion and love in their own life. He doesn't offset knowledge against feelings at all. Remember, this is the guy that wrote a book on logic. He says, rather, true and clear thinking should lead to right feeling. And he's very pastorally aware. At one point in this work, he discusses different personalities. Some of us feel more than others and more easily than others. He discusses different temperaments, different nationalities. He discusses some of the nationalities of the world, and how the Italians or something feel rather more easily, and the Scots are a bit dour and that sort of thing. Yeah. I see. I'm half English and half Welsh, so I think I'm just perfectly balanced on there. He points out how some people feel more down in winter when the sun isn't shining. And he says, if you don't feel very much, remember that growth in godliness is far more significant than what you feel. And he warns people against over-reliance on feelings, reading too much into feelings, abuse of passions. But with the warnings and the caveats and so on, he still wants to encourage passionate faith. He believes we should feel love for God, and we should feel sorrow over sin and joy because of the gospel. He said he wrote this work to vindicate the passionate Christian, to say it's not only okay, it is right to feel for God. And he says, I know I'll be accused of being an enthusiast. Puts his hand up and says, you'll call me an enthusiast. That's fine, because this is right. And for Watts, this area of passion was again key for Christian living. Remember his view of the faculties? Reason provides direction, passions provide motivation. And he says many Christians are lackluster in their living for God because they don't feel anything. And he says, where the love of God reigns in the affections, the eye will often look up to God in a way of faith and humble dependence. The ear will be attentive to his holy word. The hand will be lifted up to heaven in daily requests. The knee will be bended in humble worship. All the outward powers will be busy in doing the will of God and promoting his glory. Now, I think in recent years we've captured much more of what we might call a biblical anthropology, a kind of understanding of how we work and the place of the heart and so on in counselling and other areas. I think there's still something to learn from people like Watts, particularly this motivational effect of the passions. Where the love of God reigns, this is what will flow. And so in our pastoring and our discipling, we ask, what is it people love? Why don't they love God? How can we lead them to love God? And in all our teaching of clear knowledge, asking, how should this lead to passion? What feelings should this result in? Now, this view of passions led Watts in two very particular areas I want to finish with. The first is in preaching. Sermons in the 18th century tended to focus on rules of rhetoric. Various things like rhetoric are kind of being rediscovered from sort of classical sources. It was all about being cleverly framed and phrased. Watts said it was like oil running over marble. It was beautifully smooth and it didn't leave a trace. And so Watts asked of this current mode, who taught us any of this lazy and drowsy practice? Did God or his prophets, did Christ or his apostles instruct us in this modish art of still life, this lethargy of preaching? Did the great God ever appoint statues for his ambassadors to invite sinners to his mercy? Where the preachers become stone, no wonder if the hearers are motionless. Instead, he said, contrive all lively, forcible, and penetrating forms of speech to make your words powerful and impressive on the hearts of your hearers when light is first let into the mind. Practice all the awful, awesome, that should be today, and solemn ways of address to the conscience, all the soft and tender influences on the heart. Now notice he still talks about letting light into the mind. In his works on preaching, he talks about logical flow and structure and so on. But then make them feel what you're saying. And he basically said, pretty much, forget about the rules of rhetoric. There's some usefulness there, but forget about that. He was far more worried that the preacher himself was taken up with and felt what he was speaking. So he said, when the words freeze upon his lips, the hearts of his hearers are freezing also. But where we find devout affection mingled with solid argument in the discourse, there the lips of the preacher seem to speak light and life at once. And he helps communicate the holy passion all around him by feeling it first himself. Notice his ideal there is light and life, clarity, solid argument, and feeling, warmth, life. And I think there's much greater appreciation of both clarity and warmth in preaching today, and I think nonconformity actually has a great track record of preserving the place of passion in preaching. I think possibly the application for us would be more individual. How do we do in these areas? So, for example, I know myself, I'm pretty logical. So I'm usually clear in my preaching. I don't have to work to be clear. Well, I do, but that comes easily. I have to spend longer working on my heart and raising my temperature, as it were, as to how I feel about what I'm saying, and contriving forcible language that will impress on people's hearts. Now, some of you might feel passionate about your topic very easily. You might need some logic, so people follow what you're saying. But how do we do on light and life? Lastly, then, what's on praise? In Watts's day, the majority of churches sang metrical psalms. That is, psalms just translated into English and turned into a meter so you could sing them to a tune, because they were God's hymn book. And Watts was groundbreaking in writing what we know of as the modern hymn. He wasn't the first to do it. Others had done it, but it hadn't been done before in such quantity and certainly not such quality. So they were just little offerings from a few people, and then what's produced is like an entire hymn book. That's why he's called the father of modern hymnody. But Watts also wrote a version of the Psalms, which was standard to do in his day, and he did it differently. He paraphrased the Psalms so that they spoke more clearly of Christ and the Christian life. He said he wanted to make David speak as a Christian. Let me give you an example. Psalm 72. Psalm 72 is a prayer for Solomon as king, and that Solomon's reign would extend from sea to sea. So when Watts comes to write a hymn based on his version of Psalm 72, he writes, Jesus shall reign where'er the sun does his successive journeys run. Because he knows Jesus fulfills kingship themes. We don't want to sing of Solomon. We want to sing about Jesus. And if we're limited to metrical psalms, we can't sing of Jesus. And he writes works defending what he's doing here. He was slated for this by some people, for thinking he could write better hymns than the Holy Spirit. And he said, no, the Psalms were perfect for their place in salvation history, but that's not our place. Now, the reason for writing his hymns and adjusting the Psalms the way he did was his view of the passions. He said if we only sing the metrical Psalms, we can't sing about Jesus and we can't express what we feel. So he says this, thus by keeping too close to David in the house of God, the veil of Moses is thrown over our hearts. If we limit ourselves to the Psalms, then we don't allow our hearts to be expressed. And this connects with his sort of theology of praise, if you like, with what he sees singing for. Let us remember that the very power of singing was given to human nature chiefly for this purpose, that our warmest affections of soul might break out into natural or divine melody, and that the tongue of the worshipper might express his own heart. Now, even here, Watts wasn't, again, offsetting reason and passion. He worked very hard to make his hymns very logical, very easily understandable. He threw out archaic words, for example, that people wouldn't know, wouldn't use today. I think he'd be against using these and thous. Seriously, even if he wrote them originally. He was a poet. He could write good lines. But he said if you wrote a line and it became kind of too highbrow, too highfalutin poetry, he'd scrub it out. He was practicing what was called in the 18th century the art of sinking, the bringing his level down to what was easily understandable by the common person. So he wants clear understanding, but he wants that understanding to then go hand in hand with expression of passion. And he puts this in his hymns. He guides the singers in what they should feel. So, for example, now shall my inward joys arise and burst into a song. Almighty love inspires my heart and pleasure tunes my tongue. It's a lovely verse about how our passions will be expressed in song. Or he writes this, in vain we tune our formal songs, in vain we strive to rise. Hosannas languish on our tongues and our devotion dies. Left to ourselves, our passions won't rise to God. Come, Holy Spirit, heavenly dove, with all thy quickening powers. Come, shed abroad a Saviour's love, and that shall kindle ours. The Spirit will bring God's love into our hearts, and we'll respond in love expressed in praise to him. His view of passion drove him to write his hymns and to completely reform the praise of the church of the day. Now, we don't sing metrical psalms by and large and need to listen to Watts's arguments on that. I think Watts would ask us, do we have a developed theology of praise and worship? Or is that just something we kind of do because we've always done it? Do we know how we think the passions fit in that? In our churches, do we lead services in the way we choose songs and the tunes and the music and so on? Do they give both clarity of thought and both allow and encourage expression of passion? That's a very culturally determined area, but I think those are the questions Watts would ask for us. Those are some thoughts on the life of Isaac Watts. And perhaps in conclusion, one of the main things we should see and learn is that all that Watts did here came from significant theological thought and engagement. It was because he had a robust and thoughtful theology of the faculties and the effect of sin and the effect of conversion and so on that meant he engaged in all these areas. Now, you might expect me to say this because I spend part of my time working at a theological college. But we need pastors, leaders who are theologically informed, who have a rigorous underlying theology of this and other areas that would allow us to engage with our culture, speak to it rightly, and connect theological thought to life and ministry. And Watts was a great example of making that connection. Well, I'm going to stop there, and we have a little bit of time for some questions. So, there are a couple of people with microphones, and please do wait for a mic to reach you. But if you want to raise a hand, if you have a question on anything I've said, anything about Watts' lessons for today, start waving your hand. I probably won't be able to see it because these lights are quite bright, but I hope the people with the mics will be able to. There's a hand over there I can see, and a microphone is on its way there. If you would like to ask, do keep a hand up, and we'll bring a mic to you while we're talking to the next person. Over here first.
Yeah, thank you ever so much for what you said. Could you clarify for us, when you're talking just now about passions, when we read Jonathan Edwards, we hear about affections. You use the word emotion. The common word now is passionate. Do all these mean exactly the same thing, or can you clarify that for us, please?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. I will do my best, but it's a bit complicated. So in the 17th century, people would differentiate between passions and affections and think of passions as more passive, things like fear or awe, you just feel it. And affections were more voluntary, you could guide them, sympathy, love. By the 18th century, they're starting to be used synonymously, and Watts uses them completely synonymously. And I use the word passion because he uses it the most, but he uses the two the same way. When you come to Edwards is writing later than Watts, but he uses the word affections, and he effectively sees affections and passions as the same, like Watts does, but he thinks of passions as kind of more violent affections. So they've become of the same thing. It's only a quantitative difference. But around the middle of the 18th century, you start to get the word emotion being used, which then becomes the standard term for today. So that's a little history. One significant bit of that about the 17th century, if you're interested, I'll tell you even if you're not interested, is things like the Westminster Confession and so on talk about God as being without body or passions, but they don't say he's without affections. And back then, that was a difference. Whereas today, if you just make passions equal emotions, you think they're saying he's got no emotions. Anyway, I'll stop there. There was a hand up here somewhere.
Just a point of clarification or historical chronology.
Yeah.
Did Watts come to a better mind about his Trinitarian speculations? I'm thinking of his Trinitarian hymn where he says, where reason fails with all its powers, their faith believes and love adores.
Yeah, that's well remembered. And that's a lovely example of where he is at his best in his view of reason. Reason fails, it can't understand it, but faith prevails, and then we're led into worship. He wrote most of his hymns earlier in his ministry, so that's not a sort of an end point that he's changed his mind. And in many ways, he continues, unfortunately, to wrestle in a rather perplexed way with his work on the Trinity all the way through. His early works on the Trinity just state the orthodox position and defend it. Then it becomes more convoluted, and he ends up still kind of revolving around by the end of his life. Others, there's a hand there. Yeah.
My mother lives in Southampton, and she lives a few hundred yards from the Isaac Watts Memorial Church, which, as far as I know, is a fairly dead congregational church. And we've spoken about Isaac Watts' legacy in terms of his hymns and poetry, but what about his ecclesiology? Because it seems to me there hasn't been any very strong legacy from that.
In terms of ecclesiology, do you mean his effect on the congregational church?
Yes, the church that he lived and worked in and presumably influenced.
Yes, well, I think he did have a significant influence in stemming the flow towards rationalism and sort of early liberalism effectively in his day. But that is the way, in the 18th century, the Presbyterian church, and then the Congregational church less so, but still drifted that way. So I think he could only do as much as he could in his lifetime, and I think he did stem the flow, but after that, the Congregational church, by and large in this country, drifted into liberalism. So his legacy, in that sense, his legacy is lost. Others, I can't see any. Yeah.
Our current age is emotional, and Pentecostalism has some emotional manifestations and a form of worship which is quite emotional, and yet probably a lot of our churches undershoot on the emotional content of our worship.
Yeah.
What would you say to that with what you've learned from Watts? What would Watts say to us?
I think I'd say I agree. What would Watts say? Well, and it is fascinating. He describes some churches as where the duty of the pastor is simply to make the passage clear, and it's the duty of the listeners just to understand, and that's it. And then he says, on the other hand, other people, so there's no passionate expression. On the other hand, other people have made their religion consist entirely in the working of their passions. And he could be describing some forms of conservative evangelicalism and charismaticism today. Some forms. And I think he would encourage us to connect the two. Now, I do think that what passionate expression looks like is going to vary between different cultures and different church cultures. And you can't just flick a switch and change the culture of your church. I don't mean to promote books, but I have written a book on emotion. There is a chapter on worship. I try and get into some of this and engage with some of the issues. And I think we want to encourage churches where, of course, there's clarity and understanding, and there is what I'd call kind of appropriate, passionate expression for who we are. But thinking through what that's going to look like, I think takes a fair bit of thought. And it's not as simple as, I just want more hands in the air. Because I think passionate how we express it is quite an involved thing. But we want it. Another one? There's a hand here.
Could you tell us what a typical worship service would have been like in Watts's day?
I can, because there's a description of a service from Watts's church, in fact, in one record. But I can't remember it completely. I mean, compared to today, we would think of it as pretty kind of dull. It's sort of opening prayer, a psalm or a hymn, a reading, another psalm, a pastoral prayer, hymn, sermon, hymn, or something like that sort of thing. What I think would have been quite different about it would have been the prayers. So in my book on what's got a chapter which talks about his view of preaching and prayer, which I've not mentioned at all now. And some preachers were as well known, if not better known, for their prayers than their sermons. You didn't just say, if you heard so-and-so preach, you said, if you heard so-and-so pray. And the prayers were, you're going to guess how long they were at this stage as well. So that would have been one very marked difference. But it would have been a bit of a kind of hymn sandwich in our terms. Doddridge, who's kind of a protege of Watts a little bit later, writes to him at one point telling him about a time when one of his hymns was being sung, and talks about people being choked with emotion and tears thrown down their face, and some had to stop singing because they were so overcome. And he writes to Watts to say, basically encourage him in his hymn writing. And knowing Watts would think this was kind of great. Watts would also say, well, was it from truth? Why are they feeling it? He'd want truth and passion together. But there would be some passionate expression as well, even within that sort of what to us would sound like formality. Any others? There's a hand right up over there.
Sorry, I thought you'd finished, so I didn't want to take time from other questions. That was very helpful, very enjoyable. I am bitterly disappointed we didn't sing a hymn.
If you knew what my singing voice was like, you wouldn't be disappointed at all. Should we stop there?